Okay, so my name's Austin, and this is my next video in the series on why I love the novel Infinite Jest. In this video, I'm not going to talk about a specific section, but rather the character of James Incandenza, and give an overview of the way the novel describes him as a filmmaker. I think James as a character is used as a vehicle to give certain ideas on artists, the work they make, their audiences, and most importantly, how an audience member can choose the way they engage with the art they're interacting with. That this is a choice. Although I don't consider James to be a direct representation of David Foster Wallace, I do think his character serves the purpose of allowing Wallace to give a plea to his audience on the way he would like this novel to be approached, almost begging people to read it a certain way, with that way being to, as they're going through it, sit there and ask themselves the question, why? Why would someone choose to sit down day after day after day to create a work of art like this? Why would someone choose that particular word in that circumstance? Why would someone choose to create that character? So on and so forth. That I really think David Foster Wallace wants his novel to be approached through that question. And I think James gives the audience an invitation to do so by using his work and various characters' perspectives on his work to really emphasize the idea of artistic intention and how so much of a work of art has an incredible amount of intention put into it, whether or not the audience picks up on it. And there are ways that I think this novel describes artistic intention in a very general way, and then there are ways that it describes artistic intention in a way that can be paralleled to this novel itself. One of the general descriptions of how a work of art can have an incredible amount of intention put into it is when it goes through Joelle's internal monologue of how she became fascinated with James's movies in the first place, and how she would pick up on things that maybe a character like Oren didn't. When she's thinking through how she fell in love with the work, she talks about how after she had watched certain movies multiple times, she started to pick up on certain details that she hadn't noticed before. In particular, these very short shots that might not even last a second of like a character with a certain expression on their face. How this is something that would just flash up on the screen and disappear maybe before you even realized it. She, as someone who has messed around with cameras and lenses and things like that, can realize that even if a shot takes up an incredibly small amount of runtime, this does not mean it involved an incredibly small amount of work. Every shot that gets included in the final edit, no matter how short it is, takes a lot of work, because for every single one of them, she knows that you have to get an actor and makeup, you have to get lights, you have to get mics, cameras, lenses, all of these things set up, all of these individual elements of a shot to make it happen. And this is true whether or not the shot lasts for 5 seconds or 0.2 of a second. And so her character goes to show that art, even in the tiniest details, can have an incredible amount of intention, and how, if anything, having a very specific thing, have a very small thing be specific, it's almost certainly very important to the artist. And so it opens the door to ask, why would someone include this very specific detail? Another general description of artistic intention is through the character of Hal, and how it talked about him wondering, what was going through his dad's mind as he would be sitting in his editing chair viewing dailies and working through it. And this, along with a few other things in the book, really goes to show that it's not like someone just chooses to sit down and, make a book or make a movie or something like that. It's not a single choice to produce a work of art. Someone might decide to start one in a single choice, but in order to actually make it, instead of it just being one overarching choice, it's actually the summation of a million different decisions. As a writer sits down on any individual day, every sentence is a choice. Every word is a choice. Every edit is a choice. And so a work of art can't really be viewed as just one overall final thing, but it should be viewed as the summation of a very large number of individual decisions. And when Hal is wondering what was going on in his dad's mind during specific decisions, it sort of shows that, any element of a work of art can be considered, you can wonder how a person's humanity filtered into that piece of the work. What is it about their perspective that led to them making that individual decision? And maybe how on that day they felt different than other days. And how this is another thing that a person can explore as they're engaging with a work of art. So those two things with Joelle and Hal are just general ways that art can be approached. But there are also examples of, the artistic intention of James and Cadenza being able to, you can parallel it with things specific to the novel Infinite Jest. And one of the best examples of this comes when James, as a wraith, is talking to Gately in the hospital. And he is giving a discussion of figurants who would be, these actors in certain scenes that, although they were in the background looking like they were talking, as background characters, they were really just mouthing words. They weren't actually producing any noises, because you wouldn't want the sounds that they're making to interfere with the audio of the main dialogue of the story. And it gives the specific example of the show Cheers, where you have all the people at the booths and tables just mouthing words silently, so the noises that they would make wouldn't interfere with the dialogue of a character like Sam or Diane. And how in all of his movies, James chose to not have this happen. That he didn't want any character to be a figurant. That if there was an actor in his scene in the background that their character was talking, that actor would actually make noise. And how many critics viewed this as him just being hostile to his audience. But in reality, even if the decision to have all characters speak, all actors speak, even if that did end up making things harder for the audience, that wasn't the goal. It was just a side effect. That the real goal was to produce something that was hyper-realistic, that was so realistic that it was almost painful to turn into a work of art. And this is something that I think can be directly translated to this novel with an idea that I've brought up before of how the story within this book, the various, characters' monologues, everything is very, very chopped up and hard to follow, right? A person could be going through their inner monologue, and then, you would have a random paragraph injected, or you would have a hyphenated section injected, or you would have maybe some more structural elements like having the book not be in chronological order at all, or probably most notoriously, the endnotes, where someone reading a section would have to flip to the back of the book, read something, and come back, and by the time they finished the endnote and came back, they forgot what was going on. And so, the text of this novel is very, very broken up. It's very divided to the point where even just following a single character's internal monologue, is hard to do, let alone the actual story and plot or anything like that. It is hard to keep track of all of these things. And this is something that could be viewed as, being hostile towards the audience, that you're just making things hard on the reader. It shouldn't be this much work to read a novel. But I think this is, once again, in the similar way that with James's movies and having figure and speaking, the elements of challenge presented to the audience were just a side effect of trying to produce something real. And how in this book it can be viewed as all of the style and elements used to make the text really broken up and hard to follow, the challenges associated with that are just a side effect of trying to realistically represent, a human's thought process. That as you're sitting there on any individual day, it's not like you have a completely coherent stream of conscience that just boom, 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 goes directly from one element to the next. It's, you might be thinking about something, and then a noise happens that distracts you, or anything like that just draws your attention away. You might just think about something else for a second until eventually you come back, right? No human's internal experience is linear. It is always completely chopped up. And so the disruption that the novel presents itself with, it is hard for the audience, but it is really, in many ways, just a hyper-realistic representation of the conscious experience of a human being. And this is something where I think the character of James is used to give the audience an opportunity to reflect on the novel they're reading in a way that they can choose to engage with the book. But one of the main ways, or probably the most significant way, that the character of James and his movies are used as an invitation to the audience is through the character of Hal and how he struggles to understand why his father would put certain things into his movies. Like when he's reflecting on the film within the book, Accomplice, that how it's this just very violent, almost grotesquely violent, doesn't feel necessary, that, it's just a very upsetting story that can make someone's stomach uncomfortable. That the character of Hal sits there and wonders why his father would even make something like that. But this idea of the movie and the way Hal reflects on it can be taken at a more meta level, because in the same way that the character produced a movie that was ultra violent, David Foster Wallace, as an author, wrote a story that was ultra violent and chose to include it in his novel. To put something that seems like it has no relevance to the rest of the book, something that's really upsetting, right? He chose to include that in the body of the novel. And in the same way that the character of Hal is sitting there wondering why, I, as the reader, now get to sit there and wonder why David Foster Wallace would make that decision. And so overall, I think this is one of the purposes of the character of James in Cadenza, to get a reader to focus on artistic intention and to perhaps realize that the novel they're reading has the same exact level of intention that the character is being described as having. Anyways, that's all I have for this video.